Hello, I'm Dr. Drew Gittner here at Midwest Chiropractic Neurology. Going to be doing a webinar here for you guys today on stress. This is going to look at the neuroscience behind stress, how chronic stress is going to affect your brain, how it's linked to things like cancer and autoimmune disease, and what we can do to combat that. So things we can do supplement-wise and how we approach handling that here in our office. So before we get started on that, I just want to go over with anyone watching the webinar how they can get in touch with our office. I'm going to be posting a link. If you look just below this video, it'll have a link to our booking page where you can go on and you can book a 15-minute discovery call with our health coach, Carla Roach, to make sure that this is going to be the right fit for you and that we can provide the care that you need here in our office so you can get the results you're looking for. So I'm going to share my screen here with you guys so you can see where to go to our booking page. So when you go to our booking page, it's going to look like this. On our booking page here, you can see at the top the link to go to, and that's what I'm going to have pasted below. If you click on that link, when you go to this page, you just click on the 15-minute discovery call. It's going to show you where she has availability, and then you can click on any of the slots to get scheduled. I'm going to click on the one for Monday. You can select the time here, and then it'll send you an email letting you know that your booking is created and that you're on the schedule. There's going to be a follow-up health assessment we want you to complete before that meeting, simply because that'll give Carla some information about where you're at currently with your health status, and that helps us determine some targeted questions to ask in that first call to see if we're a good fit for you. Okay, so now I'm going to jump over to my other screen here so we can get into talking about stress. So when it comes to stress, we need to work against it, right? Stress is something that's always impacting us. I have on here as a title, The Silent Killer, and that's because stress underneath the surface is constantly impacting our health. And a lot of times it's impacting our health negatively. So much stress that we deal with in today's world. I mean, post-COVID, people have reported that their stress levels have went up significantly, and that stress is coming from multiple areas of our life where we feel like we don't have a lot of control. So if we can't control the stress coming at us, we need to control how we react to it. So let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today in the webinar. What causes stress and how does our brain deal with stress? So understanding a little bit about where it comes from and how our brain is going to be responding to that stress either optimally or suboptimally. What are the different stress hormones and where do they come from? So as far as what systems in our body make hormones that respond to stress, knowing the areas that make them and how they are kind of activated and triggered is very important to understanding why you feel a certain way when you are under stress. What are the most important objectives to combat stress? Stress and the connection to cancer, very important to understand that and be working ahead of the curve when it comes to cancer, because once you have it, it's much harder to correct and you're already kind of down the line with that, where we want to be ahead of that and preventing those things from even forming in the body. Stress and the effect on the brain. So what stress does to the brain long term is going to dictate how the body is going to respond and whether you're going to get sick and have a poor quality of life or whether you're going to be able to maintain a high quality of life in the presence of stress. Stress impacts on the inflammatory response. So the immune system, how does that react to stress? How does our inflammatory response kind of get out of check when we are under chronic stress? How can we test and quantify these different areas? So we do some testing here in the office to be able to quantify how your body's dealing with stress. How much stress are you under? How is it impacting your body down the line outside of the brain in that adrenal axis and your neurotransmitters? And I'll be going through that more in depth today. And how do we proactively address these areas so you can tip the odds in your favor? Everything is percentages. There's no guarantee on anything, but if you're doing the correct things and utilizing all those tools that you have, whether that be supplements, lifestyle change, coaching, goal setting, those sort of activities can help skew those odds in your favor. Now, instead of it being 50-50 chance, now it's 70-30. Now it's 80-20. You're really making sure that you're doing everything you can to avoid the negative health outcomes when it comes to chronic stress. First thing I want to explain for people, just to kind of get an overall concept of how stress is integrated into your brain and your body and interpreted. I use the threat bucket analogy. So you see the bucket there on the page. The bucket is essentially how much stress you can handle. It's your brain, your nervous system, your body. Every person's bucket is a little bit different. It may be larger, it may be smaller. The size of that bucket is dependent on how resilient your body is and how healthy you are at any given moment. So you see the bucket there. There's a spout on the side here. That spout on the side, you can see pain comes out of that. So every activity that happens throughout your day, good or bad, right? Exercise we would think of as a good stress. Learning is good for us, but can be stressful. And then all of these other factors here that go into the bucket and start to fill it up, right? Our brain and our body have to respond to these things, either positively or negatively. And at a certain point, if we start to reach that point of being overwhelmed, we then get pain, a response from the brain saying, hey, something's wrong. You're loading too much onto me. I'm going to make you feel uncomfortable. And it's not always pain. It could be nausea. It could be dizziness. It could be anxiety. It could be fear. These different emotions and other symptoms we can have are also another sign that our body is overwhelmed and it doesn't know how to respond properly. But pain is typically the one that tends to happen first. And over time, as that bucket starts to fill and we ignore pain and we try to push through and we don't address emptying that bucket faster, the anxiety, the depression, brain fog, migraines, indigestion, weight gain, diabetes, arthritis, fertility problems, and on and on and on start to come out and start to present themselves as symptoms in the body. So other threats, other things that cause the bucket to shrink would be physical traumas and injuries. It's even the small things, the little slip and falls, the everyday pounding the pavement, standing on concrete, sitting at your office desk. All those things are going to add stress to the body in a physical manner. Emotional and mental stressors. This is a huge one with what happened during COVID and how where most people's stress has increased is we're constantly overthinking our environment because we don't have control over those factors as much as we used to. And then the chemical toxins. So the things in our environment we're exposed to, like air pollution. You look at going to the gas station, the fumes and the things that we put on our body when it comes to makeup and deodorants and all of the manufactured products we have. I mean, it goes on and on where those things are coming from in our environment, and our body has to process those as well. So if we're not paying attention to the warning signs to tell us what is wrong or when things are going wrong, and then we're starting to get all of these symptoms, but we're not addressing the stress that's really preventing our body from overcoming that, healing and getting past it, those things are just going to continue to come back. So stress is the non-specific response of the body to any demand for change. So any change in your environment, a stress response helps you adapt to it and respond to it. It's non-specific. It means it's the same response regardless of any stressor. So good or bad, you're having that same response. It's maybe not necessarily to the same level, and the appropriateness of that response is based on the level and how often it's activated and how long we stay in that response. So the primary question the brain is asking when it comes to all of these threats that we just discussed is, am I safe or is this safe? If the brain answers that question as yes, you activate your rest and digest pathway. You get certain activation of brain areas where you can process things rationally. You remain calm. You can solve problems better in this state. and you don't release as much cortisol. It dulls that stress response enough, so you just can get enough to respond, but you're not going into full-blown panic mode, and that's going to be a lot healthier long term for the body. We're going to discuss a little bit more why that is in slides coming up. When the answer is no, I'm not safe, or this is not safe, or I feel uncomfortable, whatever it may be, you start to have irrational processing of emotions. You start to feel very irritable. You feel angry. You feel sad. You feel afraid. You start to get very anxious. You notice changes in your body physically. You may get red in the face. You may start to breathe shallow. You may start to hold tension in your shoulders. Lots of different indicators that you're going into fight or flight, that your body is going into protection mode. And that's what the activation of the HPA axis is. It's what allows you to go into that fight or flight state and produce those things in your body so you can do that. Now, we don't want to stay there too long, and we're going to talk a little bit more about why that is. So connecting pain, stress, and your gut. So gut health is another very important aspect when it comes to people who are under chronic stress. Their gut doesn't tend to work well, and this slide is going to help explain why that is. So when you get a change in signaling to the brain, if we start up here on number 1, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there's signals coming in from the body to the brain through the nervous system. The brain receives those signals and then has to decide what to do, sends a response back out through the nerves to all the cells, tissues, organs in the body. When the decrease or increase in signals from the part of the body, let's use neck as an example here. Most people have experienced neck pain at some point or discomfort. So when there's a change in the signaling from the neck to the brain, the way the brain responds in most cases is pain. Stiffness, tightness, pain, achiness, those sort of things are the brain's way of saying, hey, something's wrong. Something's changed here. I don't want you to continue using your neck the way you have because I don't want you to do further damage. It's that protection mechanism. Now, when pain is activating in the body, we're also getting that non-specific response to change, your stress response turning on. So that's where cortisol and then also epinephrine, norepinephrine, those are the catecholamines they're called. We'll call them CATs in this PowerPoint just for ease of access to that word there. So you release cortisol and CATs in response to this pain activation. And those are going to release from your adrenal glands down here above the kidneys. Those adrenal glands dump those things into the bloodstream. Hormones act in the blood. So it's not as specific as the nervous system. You can't get individual cell activation and very targeted responses. You get responses globally in the entire body. So every cell in the body that gets blood flow is now exposed to those hormones. So when those hormones release, what they do when they circulate up to your stomach and into your digestive tract is they actually turn the stomach off. So you see how it says it's going to deplete stomach acid. Stomach acid is very important for digesting protein and for also killing off any of the bad bacteria, germs, things that come in on our food that shouldn't make it further into the digestive tract. Zinc and magnesium also start absorbing in the stomach. So you're not going to absorb those minerals as well. And those minerals are very important for you to be able to produce hormones, to be able to have optimal muscle and joint health, to have a healthy reactive immune system. So if we start getting depleted in nutrients as a result of chronic stress, that's another huge issue. But looking back at the stomach acid, as that food and low amounts of stomach acid move to the next stage of digestion, that's very important for triggering your liver and gallbladder to release bile to digest fats. And it's very important for triggering your pancreas to release enzymes to digest carbohydrates and other nutrients. So if we're not getting the full release from these two organs, we're not going to fully digest our food. Our gut's going to slow down. It's going to start to hold those things there. And this is that feeling like you have a rock in your stomach, or very bloated and gassy, and it looks like you're bulging at the top of your stomach, not above your belly button in that area. And that's because that food's just sitting there. It's trying to digest, but now all the bacteria that are in that area of the small intestine are starting to chew up and work on that as well. And they start to kind of steal nutrients, especially if we didn't kill off the ones we don't want in that area, or even the good bacteria can get too we can have too many of them in that area, and that can cause problems with digestion as well. So that stomach acid is one of the first components I look at with a patient. We do a test. It's just a simple challenge here in the office that allows us to determine how much stomach acid you're producing, and is your chronic stress negatively impacting your digestion at that first stage. So when that food is not fully digested, what it does is it ends up doing damage to the gut lining. So the immune system detects that food is not digested as it moves lower into your system, around areas 6 and 7 into the small, large intestine, lower down in the digestive tract. And what it's going to do is it's going to respond and start to attack those things, the larger food particles, the bacteria that's made it through. And as it's doing that, it starts to chew away at the single cell lining of your gut that separates the blood from the inside of the intestine, where things that should go out of the body will remain. So if it's easy to pass through that cell layer into the blood, now that inflammatory response and all of those bacteria and those pathogens that should stay in the intestine get into the blood. Now they circulate systemically through the rest of the body, back up to the neck where we had the original change in signaling, or the original injury or insult. And now this cycle just runs and runs and runs. So we need to break this cycle by restoring signaling. That's the chiropractic side of things. That's why we adjust the spine. That's why we work on extremities and nerve pathways, and making sure that they're conducting signals and gathering information for the brain as accurately as possible. That in turn shuts down that pain response, and then the stress response starts to come back down. But this is what we're talking about today, stress, right? There's other ways that we can reduce stress as well. And that's what we really want to focus on today, because it's going to have other implications for our health beyond the gut. So meeting the adrenals, these are the adrenal glands here. They're your glands that sit right above the kidneys, as I described before, and they're kind of a 2-in-1 gland. So there's an outer portion and an inner portion, and the different portions produce the different hormones. So outer shell is going to produce your cortisol, and this is going to make you feel awake and alert, and it's kind of that get up and go in the morning hormone. So cortisol is not all bad, but if we have too much of it too often, that's where we can have problems. DHEA is the other hormone in the outer shell of the cortex, and DHEA is the hormone that kind of brings us back to that rest and digest state, and it's all what allows us to heal. So this is another one of those hormones. If you've heard of a youth hormone like growth hormone, DHEA is another one that allows us to heal properly and maintain our bodies long term after we've had a stress response. So it's really an interplay of cortisol and DHEA that's going to allow us to respond to changes and then heal if there's any damage as a result of that response. So inner core is where we produce norepinephrine and epinephrine. These are the cats. So these are those hormones that make your heart pump faster, your blood pressure go up, your pupils dilate. I mean, there's lots of different responses to these. This is adrenaline, right? When you have an adrenaline rush, think about what you feel like. You feel amped up, you feel very heightened state of awareness. So that's what those two are going to do. And we're going to see how the interplay of these four affects our body and our different cells as we go through the presentation. So the HPA axis is composed of your hypothalamus here in the brain, your pituitary gland, which we see larger here, and then your adrenal glands here. The thyroid is also another organ that's involved with the HPA axis. But that's more involved with metabolism, regulating body temperature, some other processes in the body. So when we look at how this HPA axis activates the brain, getting those signals coming in from the body, like we talked about, is going to send signals down through the pituitary gland and then the pituitary gland is going to respond to the hormonal release and then release its own hormones that then go down to the adrenal glands and stimulate cortisol secretion, epinephrine, norepinephrine secretion. And when that happens, those hormones that go into the blood and circulate, they circulate back to the pituitary gland, back to the hypothalamus, where these hormones, these activating hormones are released. And when they circulate back, these areas say, okay, enough of the end response we wanted was secreted. Now we're going to shut down. So very much a feedback loop is what this is called. And that feedback is very important to have it interpreted correctly by these areas. So that way that response turns off. But if the signaling coming into the brain and how you're interpreting those signals continues to turn this pathway back on and ignores the feedback, it's overriding the feedback, that's where we end up with problems. So you're going to see increases in blood sugar, breakdown in muscle, increases in body fat, breakdown in bone for calcium. Those things don't sound like positives, do they? I mean, none of these things correlate to good health. So if we're chronically stuck here, these things are chronically happening, and people who have these things going on for long terms tend to suffer health-wise. So the reducing in thyroid function, the reduce in antibody production, and the reduction in gut immunity, these three things are what we're going to dive into a little bit more later on. So thyroid is going to be that metabolism, your body's ability to process nutrients and utilize them for the different functions in your cells and what you need going on in your body is going to be affected by chronic stress. Reduction in antibody production. So your immune system actually dips in times of chronic stress. And this is why we typically tend to get sick after we've gone through a very stressful period. We may be able to sustain it through the stress, but on the backside of it, that immune system has dipped so far that now without that resiliency of the stress response, once those hormones go away, our immune system is still down, and now we're susceptible to getting sick, and we tend to have those things happen after chronic stress. Reduction in gut immunity. So our body's defense against anything that we're putting into our body, so it's not allowed to get into the rest of the body, into the bloodstream, and to cause infections and things like that, that's reduced as well. So looking at cortisol now a little bit closer, because this is going to help us understand the testing that we do in the office and why we look at this. So when it comes to sleep and being awake and feeling alert, cortisol has a cycle. So in the morning, cortisol should increase drastically within the first 30 minutes of waking up. And then over the next 30 minutes, cortisol should start to drop back down, and then it will continue to fall throughout the day. Because at night, when it starts to get dark out, we need to start to feel tired, drowsy, so we can then sleep and rest and rejuvenate from the trials of the day. So where patients tend to have issues is you'll see in this area when it switches from light to dark, they have trouble falling to sleep. They can't kind of get to that rest and digest. And melatonin, which makes us feel drowsy and tired, has to take over as the dominant hormone in order for us to go through our normal sleep patterns and sleep cycle. So this is why people would take melatonin for difficulty sleeping. But what you're doing, if your cortisol, because of chronic pain or chronic stress, is staying too high, you're actually just shifting the entire cycle up and increasing your concentrations of these hormones in your bloodstream. And now you just need more and more and more over time to get the same effect, which we don't want. Then there's also the issue of regulating your blood sugar that happens later. So we see this red arrow here and the little bump of cortisol that happens. That's related to keeping blood sugar available for your body. You don't eat while you're asleep, so you need that blood sugar to be able to run your brain and body processes, which is why we tend to get a little bit of cortisol release overnight. Now, if we're someone who's chronically stressed and we have an overactive stress response, that can be enough to wake us up. Or if our cortisol levels stay too high, just because our adrenal glands and things are always on high alert, now we wake up in the middle of the night, we can't fall back asleep. Those are the patients that are like, I fall asleep fine, but I'm waking up, I'm not going back to bed, I'm tired when I wake up in the morning. So that's kind of how cortisol, melatonin on a very basic level correlate with sleep and where we can see some issues with that. So what should our objectives be? Move this out of the way to combat stress effectively. What do we need to do? What should be our primary focus in managing stress? It's obviously important, but why is it important? So first one is protecting cells and preventing cancerous mutations. When we're under chronic stress, we're going to go over this in more detail, your cells start to change. You start to damage your DNA, and that's what allows cancer to start growing and forming in the body. If you're producing cancer cells at any rate, that is not ideal. But with chronic stress, it starts to speed up. We need to protect the brain. The brain is what makes the decision on how we respond to stress. We covered that a little bit earlier. If the brain is turning on that fight or flight system and dumping those stress hormones, cortisol, and the CATs into the bloodstream, bad things start to happen and the brain starts to suffer as a result. And now it's a feed forward cycle. It's not a feedback cycle. It actually starts to trigger more damage, more maladaptation, you would call it. Reduce sustained inflammation and related disorders. So this is looking at chronic inflammation leading to autoimmune diseases like Crohn's disease, IBS, rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto's disease of the thyroid. I mean, any of the ways that our body can start attacking our own tissues and our own cells, inflammation out of control is how that happens. And that's where chronic stress is related to that as well. So important to understand down here on the bottom, stress is intimately related with cancer. They did a study and they looked at divorced women. 50% of divorced women developed cancer within 3 years of their divorce. So very high stress, event in life to go through is a divorce. A lot of times things don't end well. And 50% of women developed cancer within 3 years as a result of that stress. 3 years is not a long time. And anyone who goes through a stressful time, depending on your genetics, which we're going to look at earlier, depending on how well you process stress, it's not so much a if you get cancer, it's a when. And that's what the research shows. And this research came out 1 year and 2 years ago, so it's brand new. These are things we need to be integrating into our society, integrating into our healthcare, because trying to treat cancer downstream is not nearly as effective as preventing it altogether. So why should we care about stress? So the recent studies that I just mentioned that have shown chronic stress can induce tumor genesis, which is the growth of cancer cells in the body. The source for this, if anybody wants to reference the research study, is down here on the bottom, and you can see it came out in 2020 during the middle of COVID, and it was published in the Frontiers in Oncology, a very, very prominent journal when it comes to cancer research, and what's going on in the kind of new field of cancer prevention and research. So chronic stress activates the HPA axis. We were talking about that HPA axis earlier, and the sympathetic nervous system. That's the other branch that turns on when the HPA axis is being activated, and that is directly overseen by the brain. That activation leads to a decline and dysfunction of your frontal cortex. Your prefrontal cortex is the front kind of lumpy part of your brain. That front part of your brain is what makes human beings different than animals. It's what gives us the ability to act against instincts, to reason, to think things through, to problem solve. And then it also affects the hippocampus, which is where we have memory. So when it comes to your short-term memory, when you look at word recall, those sort of things are controlled and are performed in the hippocampus. So if we're negatively impacting those, that's why over time we tend to feel like, wow, why can I not remember this? I forget names, phone numbers that I used to know, no problem, are hard to remember. Just, direction wise, I don't feel like I do as well as I used to. Those are things that chronic stress, that's part of the impact on the brain that we're seeing kind of outwardly in how we can navigate the world and perform in the world. And then chronic stress can also cause corresponding changes in the body's immune function. The inflammatory response getting out of check, like I was talking about with those autoimmune disorders, chronic stress is directly linked to that immune system. And that immune system is what keeps those tumor cells that try to grow in the body under chronic stress. It keeps them in check. It keeps them down, right? So that way they can't continue to grow in the body. They're killed off and eliminated as quickly as they form. So that's why a healthy immune system is very, very important when it comes to preventing cancer. So you see on the bottom there, one word, cancer, right? All of these things can start to correlate back to that. And then you also look at autoimmune diseases and damage to the rest of the body if it's not cancer. So neither of those things do we want to have going on. So let's look a little bit more at what was in that research study so I can explain some of these different graphics so you can get a better idea of what's going on in the body and what they discovered with these pathways, because this is with 100% certainty almost that these things are going on and these are the changes they were observing when they were performing this research. So the brain and the hormonal mechanisms are illustrated over here on the right. You can see where that hypothalamus and that pituitary gland we were talking about in the HPA axis, which is this left side pathway. That's where you're going to get the releases of those activating hormones. The adrenal gland is going to then start producing cortisol, and in chronic presence of cortisol or long-term presence of cortisol, normal cells being bound by cortisol constantly start to turn to tumor cells, and then they start to turn into immune cells that no longer identify those tumors and can actually become autoimmune cells where they start attacking your own body. The other side, where we were talking about the cats and this sympathetic nervous system, that's directly regulated by brain. There's no hormone release to activate this. The brain can turn this on and off at any given time when it wants to. So this norepinephrine, epinephrine, the adrenaline that comes out the back end, same type of impact as cortisol. And these two things tend to be released in conjunction. Rarely do we just have one. We have activation of the stress system, both the HPA axis and the sympathetic nervous system at the same time, and both of them cause the same mutations in cells over long periods of time. So we need to make sure that we're managing these two pathways and making sure we're not leaving them turned on running longer than they need to be. So let's look at what the signaling pathways. So how do these things that get released, how do they actually cause the cell to become cancer causing? This is another part of the research. When they looked at this, this is why we know that cancer is linked to stress. This is the kind of nuts and bolts of it. So don't be intimidated by this slide. I'm going to go through it and explain it in a way where we can relate it back to some symptoms and things that we're experiencing every day. So those catecholamines, when they bind to a cell, same goes for cortisol as well. It's going to activate this cyclic AMP pathway, it's called. So as that comes in, that cyclic AMP pathway is what modulates our inflammation in the inside cells. So interleukin-6 is an inflammatory cytokine, they call it. These are big words, big terms you don't need to understand. Essentially, what this does is it turns on our body's immune system to start going into high alert. Be on alert. There's things going on in the body that we need to respond to. You may need to attack, eliminate those things. But when we activate that, what it does is it actually travels inside the nucleus where our DNA is found. And DNA is what tells the cell how to operate properly, how to rebuild itself, how to make new cells. If that gets damaged, Now, when we start to produce new cells, they have a different function. They operate differently. They identify things in the body differently. And that's where we can then start to have cancer forming or tumor growth with those cells kind of going rogue. The other intermediate that gets amplified is VEGF. And VEGF is also somewhat pro-inflammatory, but it's what makes your joints and muscles achy and sore when it comes to pressure changes in the environment. So that's one where people are like, oh yeah, that old knee injury I had, I can feel it more today. And it's happening partly because under chronic stress, which changes in temperature and pressure in the weather is a stressor. We're going to get some release from these things, but if it's more than we should be, and now that VEGF gets upregulated, now we're going to feel more pain, more stiffness, more soreness as a result of that. And another thing that VEGF does when it comes to tumor growth, that's very important to understand, is cells in order to survive need blood supply. So you need to get blood to the cells so oxygen and nutrients can get to the cell so it can have the resources it needs to perform its tasks and different jobs. So VEGF actually, in the example of a cancer cell, it increases blood flow to that cell. So if we're doing DNA, if we're causing DNA damage under chronic stress, we're kind of skewing that cell to become more cancerous. And then on top of that, we're upregulating the VEGF that's going to feed blood and nutrients to that cell. Once it becomes a tumor cell and it starts to replicate and multiply, now we're supplying our tumor with more blood supply and more resources than our normal healthy cells. So it can outgrow them, it can evade the immune system. And now that's where we start to get those malignant cancers, the cancer that metastasizes and spreads throughout the body. Other organs and tissues start to form cancer. And this is what progresses cancer through those stages a lot faster if you're someone who's had that diagnosis. So this is really why we need to monitor chronic stress and inflammation in the body, because it's directly linked to the cancer. So let's look a little bit at the immune system and what cortisol and the catecholamines do there. So in the research study, again, on this slide seems intimidating, but we're just going to point out the main factors that we need to look at. So think of Th1 and Th2 here, the two different types of immune cell you have in your body. And those two need to have kind of an even ratio, right? It's always a ratio between one versus the other because both of their functions are important to the body, and we can't have one up here and one down here, or one up here and one down here, because then there's not enough balance in the two functions they perform. So what do these two things do? Th1 is the immune cell that's going to identify anything inside your body, the cells in your body that are not operating properly. It's going to say, okay, hey, you're not doing your job the way we need to. We're going to eliminate you, kill you off, take you out of the body, because we only want healthy cells that do what we tell them to do. So that's Th1. Very important when it comes to identifying those cancer cells, those cells that are starting to mutate and have been damaged, so that they can be eliminated. Th2, on the other hand, now that's the one that identifies anything foreign in your body. So when it comes to viruses, bacteria, even toxins in the body, some of those different things, Th2 is going to be the type of cell that responds to those. So we have to protect ourselves from ourselves, and we have to protect ourselves from what's out in the world and in our environment. But we have to do those things about at an even ratio to have that work optimally. So what happens when we start seeing changes in this immune system in response to stress is it actually starts to down-regulate these immune cells. So it's going to upregulate some of the interleukins that make Th2 start attacking things more, and it's going to down-regulate our tumor necrosis factor and Th1 and our ability to eliminate cancer cells. So those two things are not good to have happening, because now we start bringing autoimmune issues into play, and we start, because these Th2 cells are going to start seeing our own cells as what they need to be attacking, and our Th1 that's going to identify the cells that need to go is not going to be working as well. And that's where, when we look up here at this top kind of path, the COX-2 inhibitors, those sort of things, when you look at ibuprofen, Aleve, or naproxen, and those things that regulate IL-6, IL-10, tumor necrosis factor, VEGF, these sort of things are what gets ramped up in COVID or with a COVID infection. So people who already have chronic stress from a comorbidity or from their career or from whatever, a past injury, whether that be a head trauma or a post-traumatic stress disorder that's skewed their adrenal axis and their stress system. If that's been going on and now you add COVID to the mix, it's only going to ramp it up more. And those are the patients, those are the people that end up on ventilators that couldn't recover from COVID because their immune system just ran out of check, and started attacking their own body systems and shutting things down. So it's not always comorbidities. There's also those people that have no metabolic reserve, no ability to fuel the immune system the way it needs to help get it back in check. Their brain pattern that's firing is only active, knows how to turn the immune system on. It doesn't know how to turn it down in the correct way. And that's why COVID impacted so many patients so negatively, and why others did well when it came to COVID, as far as the research is telling us here. So when it comes to those cancer causing pathways, those immune pathways, I was talking about testing that we do that helps give us insight as to how well you're doing those things. Where do you fall in the spectrum, as far as how chronic stress is impacting you, and where you're at on that pathway towards autoimmunity, towards cancer, and these diagnoses that nobody wants. And the test that we use is called the Dutch test. So the Dutch test is dried urine samples. It's just catching a little bit of the stream on a strip, drying it, and those get sent in for analysis as to what's in the urine. And then it's also saliva samples. So a cotton swab that goes into the mouth, you chew and kind of saturate with your saliva, put it in a tube, seal it back up, that gets sent in for analysis as well. So those two samples can show us, all right, how much is being produced and stored. That's what the saliva glands are going to show us as far as the stress hormones and cortisol, because you actually store cortisol in your salivary glands after it's produced and released from the adrenal glands. And then it's going to show us what is that hormonal balance and how all of those different hormones and things are processed in the body. And then when they come out in the urine, we can see how much of them have been used and processed. So looking at the pathway that's going to tell us the most about cancer, it's going to be this green pathway here. And down where I have that red circle, you can see this dial on the left-hand side, and it says methylation activity. Now, methylation is the process in our body that removes stress hormones from the bloodstream. And methylation is how we remove toxins and different things. It's the little red flag that we add to different molecules, materials in the body to let the body know, hey, these need to go. And if we don't have that ability to flag something, then it can't go out of the body. Think of, a job site where they're cutting down trees and they're using orange spray paint on the tree to know that one needs to go, that one needs to go, this one stays. That's what our body's doing. So one of our most important nutrients, a vitamin that we need to take in, is B vitamins. B vitamins we use for methylation. They're also very important for the energy supply in our body, and it takes energy to remove things from the body and to remove waste and toxins and things from cells. So when it comes to this green pathway, if you don't have enough B vitamins, which need to be replaced every single day, if you don't replace your B vitamins on a daily basis and you run deficient, this methylation will suffer. And we'll see in this test that you will run towards the low end of the spectrum. And when you're not methylating well, the other pathways that things run down, these metabolites come down, is this red pathway that ends in that DNA damage. So you can see methylation, there's two different points we can methylate down these pathways. But if we're not doing that well and we don't have those methyl donors, the B vitamins, available at the levels they need to match our chronic stress, now we're activating that pathway we just discussed above, and we're causing that DNA damage. So this test right here can tell us a lot as far as how prevalent or how likely it is that you're developing cancer right now in your body, sitting there. It's either you're getting better or you're getting worse, and this pathway is either turned on or it's not, and this test is showing us whether it's turned on or not. And now it's telling us what we need to do to turn it back off. And when we can turn that off, now your cells are improving. Now you're eliminating cancer from the body at a rate that makes sure it's not growing and overtaking the rest of your body. So this is why managing that chronic stress and knowing where you're at, where you fall, and then monitoring that the treatments and that the things that we're implementing are actually making a difference is very, 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 very important. You can't survive and have a great quality of life if you're not processing stress well. It's going to damage your body and lead to diagnoses you don't want. So the other thing we look at when we get this Dutch test, when it comes to hormones, is looking at cortisol. So what does that pattern look like? And a healthy cortisol pattern, you can see, should elevate over the first 30 minutes, decrease over the next 30, and then continue to decrease throughout the day. This response and how this happens is going to dictate how you feel energy-wise. It's going to dictate motivation. It's going to dictate your sleep patterns. It's going to dictate whether you feel anxious or overwhelmed throughout the day. So this is another very important pattern to make sure that's functioning well, along with clearing cortisol and methylating well on the back end, taking things out. So very, very insightful test that's going to tell us where you're at and what to do next to start correcting these issues, so you can feel better and live a better quality of life, and have the peace of mind that you're doing the right things, so you're not developing cancer and autoimmune diseases. So these two slides, this is going to talk a little bit more about the brain now. So let's move from the testing and the hormones and that HPA axis to how the brain plays a role in activating those things. And our brain is in charge 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, of every tissue, cell, and organ, every process, everything that goes on in our body, our brain is aware of. Which, think about how many different things are going on at any given time that you don't even have to think about, because our brain is controlling that. So very important to make sure that we're protecting the brain from the impacts of chronic stress, so it can continue to do that job as effectively as possible. So when we look at healthy stress response or stress reaction, it's ran by that prefrontal cortex I talked about a little bit earlier. And that's what makes us feel alert, safe, interested, joyful, happy, calm. That's this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. And how this should work is we should have top-down regulation of our stress response and how we respond to it. Thinking logically first, making a good, educated decision, and then having the response based off of that logic is much healthier than the opposing option, which I'll go through here in a minute. So when we have top-down regulation, this area called our amygdala and our basal ganglia is somewhat suppressed, right? It's kept in check. And our amygdala and basal ganglia are part of what we call our limbic system, which is all of our emotions. So fear, anger, sadness, anxiety, worrying, obsessive thoughts that just continually run through your mind, those things live in those areas and are part of our limbic system, as to how we react to different situations we've gone through in our life. So keeping those things in check. Then also down here, you can see at the brain stem, there's a neurologic pathway where we're going to release things like norepinephrine, which is those cats that go down into the body and affect our cells negatively. But it's keeping that norepinephrine at a lower level, so that way we're not over-activating this other pathway in the brain that's going to make us think illogically and essentially let our brain run out of control and that stress response run out of control. So let's look at this other illustration here as to what happens in the brain. And this, again, was researched back in 2015. They identified these different pathways in the brain and how these affect the neurotransmitters and the way that our brain fires long term, and it shapes our brain differently when we're under this chronic stress. So when the amygdala and the basal ganglia and the brain start firing bottom up, where our adrenals and that HPA axis, that stress response, is being activated from the bottom up, and the bottom up in the brain as well, where norepinephrine is being released in high amounts. We aren't slowing it down. We aren't suppressing it to the necessary level. It just keeps releasing. It's going to activate our amygdala and our basal ganglia, which is going to make us feel stressed. It's going to make us remember traumatic experiences that happened to us. They're going to come to the forefront of our brain. It's like, where did that memory come from? It's going to make us very impulsive. It's going to make us irritable. So we're not going to be able to tolerate, our kids in the background playing and making noise. It's just going to be too much. You're going to start having emotional outbursts, whether it's sadness or anger or depression or anxiety. It's like you can't control your emotions. You're just always fluctuating from one end to the other. And that's where this part of our brain activating over and over and over, the things that fire the most are the pathways that get ingrained the most. And now when the brain has to react to stress, it uses that pathway. And now we can't think logically. We don't make good decisions. We cause more stress for ourselves. And then we end up having anxiety and depression as a result of that poor choices. And you see how this feed forward cycle starts happening because of the way we're using our brain, or the way our brain is activating in response to the stressful situations we have to deal with. So this is very important to make sure that we protect this frontal lobe and optimize and make sure that it's running the show. Because without that, this area on the right is where most of us are living now. And you wonder why we see kids and adults who act like kids, and they're so impulsive. You can't get them to sit down for more than 5 minutes and focus on anything. They need to be go, 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 and need all this stimulation, because this is the pathway on the right here that's driving their brain function. So looking a little bit deeper into some other things that we can test with the Dutch test, which the next slide I'll go over how the Dutch test monitors those things and measures those things, so we can see what's going on. But those different pathways that I just described, it's not just epinephrine or norepinephrine that are being regulated differently in how they interact with the brain. We're also seeing changes in things like glutamate. And glutamate is a neurotransmitter. It's called the excitatory neurotransmitter. So glutamate is the gas pedal in your car. The opposing neurotransmitter would be GABA. That's the inhibitory, and that would be your brake pedal. So if you think about a car with only a gas pedal, not very useful, right? You have to be able to slow things down too and stop. Well, we need that in the brain. So under chronic stress, with the increased cortisol released from the adrenal glands coming into the cells and affecting the inflammatory response there, that inflammatory response traveling back up to the brain actually increases glutamate release. So now we're exciting all of these different areas of the brain, but that excitatory neurotransmitter, too much of it actually damages your frontal lobe. It will cause your frontal lobe to start to shrink and shrivel away, and that's not a good thing. Chiurinate is the next one. So these chiurinates are inflammation. They represent inflammation in the brain. It's a way that we can monitor and measure those. So when that chiurinate starts to increase, we know that the brain is undergoing more inflammation, and inflammation in your brain is not good. Think about brain swelling. When you go to the ER, if your brain is swollen, that's a huge emergency. They need to get that taken care of. You cannot have pressure and swelling on your brain and maintain healthy neurons. It's going to kill parts of your brain if that continues to happen. So these low levels of inflammation happening all the time within your brain are negatively impacting how it fires, and then also the overall health of the brain long term. So then you start looking at dopamine and serotonin, other neurotransmitters that we associate with feeling good and reward and happiness. and you look at all the people that are on medication to try to regulate dopamine and serotonin levels in the brain, well, why is that dysregulation happening in the first place? Chronic stress leading to inflammation, leading to downregulation of these two hormones. And when you don't have these hormones or these neurotransmitters in the proper concentrations, you're not going to get proper brain signaling. You're not going to get proper brain firing. And now that stress response is going to run even more out of control. And you see another feed forward cycle that needs to be broken. So you look at the symptoms that come out of this kind of chronic stress pathway and the effect on the brain: anxiety, avoidance behavior, emotional dysregulation, fatigue, fear, hypervigilance, psychomotor slowing. So your ability to actually, move and process information and function in the world changes. And then worrying, constant worrying about what's coming next, about what things you can't control. That sort of stuff just starts to run out of control as well. So what do we do to combat this? We need to protect our frontal lobe, and there's things supplement wise and activity wise that we can do to shut this pathway down, to stop this feed forward cycle and allow our brain to start to strengthen the correct pathway. So looking at the Dutch test and what we can measure in regards to that cycle I just talked about, and how we can see, okay, where are you starting at? And as we implement these things to combat stress, where do we end at? Because then we can remeasure and see what's changed in these different pathways. The first one that we can measure here is a B12 marker. So looking at how, and a B6 marker, the chiurinates are going to tell us how much B6 you're making and how much inflammation is going on in the brain. But these B vitamins I was talking about, these are part of your methylators, your ability to clear stress from the body. So we can tell, do you have enough methyl donors? Do you have enough B vitamins getting into the body? And then are those B vitamins helping us control inflammation of the brain by shutting down that stress response? If this is above range, like it is in this case with this person, we know that there's a negative impact on the brain from these being above that range. And we need to start controlling the stress response so that way these things aren't negatively impacting the body or the brain. Biotin, another B vitamin that we can check and see how much, and when these things are above range, you tend to be deficient because it means you're not clearing the stress. So that's kind of how to interpret and understand those. Glutathione, another marker that's going to help us determine whether inflammation is out of control in the body. And we know that inflammation negatively impacts the brain. You look at dopamine and norepinephrine. We've got markers to determine where those levels are at. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, if it's we're releasing too much of that, which we know correlates to higher levels of the chiurinates and more inflammation in the body, we see this person is above range in their epinephrine, norepinephrine release. They're under chronic stress. Their chronic stress is causing elevation of inflammation in the brain, inflammation in the entire body, but in particular the brain. So we need to get that back down under control. And then we look at dopamine. They're on the low end of the range. What's another thing that chronic stress does? It decreases dopamine. We're seeing that pattern here, and we can measure this. So this is justification as to why you feel the way you feel. It's not going to the doctor and saying everything's fine with you. Your blood work looks good. Everything's good. We're going to measure 1 point of cortisol. You're fine. You're in the range. Well, no, you don't feel fine. Why is that? This explains it. This shows you what brain chemistry is correlated to why you feel the way you do. What brain patterns of firing are making you feel the way you do. And then why you're having these chronic health issues when someone said you were fine for 10 years prior, and now in the last 2 to 3 years, you've gotten an autoimmune disorder diagnosis, you've gotten a cancer diagnosis, you developed diabetes, you had all these things that just popped up in the last 2 to 3 years. Well, this stuff was going on for years before. We just weren't measuring it and looking at it correctly to identify that there was a problem. Lastly, you can see another neuroinflammatory marker here. We see it's above range. Neuroinflammation is going to skew all of these different things, and that's what we need to be monitoring and making sure that's not happening. Protect the brain. So the supplements I recommend in office currently to combat these things, to help protect the brain, to help combat inflammation in the body. Mitocor is the multivitamin I carry. That's going to get you the source of B vitamins for methylation. Transresveratrol for antioxidation. Oxidation is the damage that happens to the DNA, and that's what can ultimately mutate that and cause those cells to become cancer forming. So transresveratrol in the mitocor helps combat that. Acetyl L-carnitine is mitochondrial support. That's energy for the cells. If our cells can't produce energy, then you can't form a response. You can't get toxins out of those cells. You can't maintain healthy cells without energy, and you can't maintain a healthy brain without energy as well. Vitamin C to help control inflammation. And these are just a few of the things in mitocor that make it great for addressing the issues we just discussed. New Adapt, this one I love. I take myself for chronic stress. I take mitocor every day myself. All four of these things I take every single day, protecting my brain from chronic stress, because there's no human being on this planet that's immune to stress. We all need support in this way. It's what makes us age. It's what causes these disorders and these diseases even before they're a diagnosis. It's what's killing us. So New Adapt, the bacopa extract that's in there, that helps regulate inflammatory cytokines that damage the brain and prevent DNA damage and preserve memory. So bacopa extract is regulating inflammation throughout the entire body, but in particular increases blood flow to the frontal cortex to help support memory and cognition. Especially in times of stress and high inflammation, bacopa extract can blunt the inflammatory response so the brain doesn't feel the negative impacts of that inflammation. Ashwagandha, rhodiola, eleuthero root are adaptogens. So adaptogens help blunt the cortisol response. So what it does is it starts to take those large spikes in cortisol and those big skews up and down, and it starts to shrink those down. So that way you get small reactions of cortisol, not these huge stress responses that are correlated to that brain function driven by the amygdala, the basal ganglia, and emotion. Copacalm, I use this because it has huperzine A in it. Huperzine A preserves the hippocampus. So when our frontal lobe can't fire, our hippocampus literally starts to shrink away. So if we can't remember what's happened to us, and this is where you start looking at Alzheimer's, dementia, and the linkage there. Bacopa extract is another one of those protective herbal supplements that helps the brain, helps cognition in those that have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia. So if we're going to try to prevent it, why not take what helps those people that already have the diagnosis? But huperzine A increases the ion channel permeability, and that's how energy and exchange of firing is going to happen in the brain. So huperzine A is essentially the ability to be resilient to stress and to be able to process things cognitively and remember things in the presence of stress. I do 2 droppers of this on my tongue morning and night. Some days I'm using it throughout the day if I have higher stress and I'm go from one thing to the next, to try to protect my brain from that feed forward cycle that's going to negatively impact it. GABA is that inhibitory neurotransmitter I talked about in the previous slides. So GABA is what's going to kind of calm the brain down. It's going to allow that frontal lobe to fire at the proper rate instead of being ramped up and overdoing it, so that way it starts to turn off. It's not always more is better. Sometimes it's finding just that right dosing, that right pinpoint of these different neurotransmitters. So glutamate is not all bad. We need some, but we don't need way too much. Same thing with GABA. We need some, but if you do way too much, well, now glutamate can't activate. It throws everything out of balance. This is why it's so hard to find an anti-depression medicine, an anti-anxiety medicine, the SSRIs, and get them dialed in. And you're always playing with dosing because your brain is not always the same. And it's everything working in conjunction with each other, which is why trying to optimize your brain firing and function so it can determine what that is, it can make adjustments way faster than we can put a medication in our mouth and have that interact with the chemistry. So that's the concept behind why Copacalm works very well to combat stress and what we're talking about here in this presentation. And then the last one is Orthomega. This is a high quality fish oil. The fish oil that I carry here in the office is as pure as you can get. It's the shortest amount of time from when you catch the fish till it's in the capsule. And that's important because fish oil can spoil. It's going to change how it affects your inflammatory response. So these essential fatty acids actually play a role in regulating those inflammatory cytokines and making sure that that pathway doesn't get out of check. And if a lot of us are deficient in this country in our essential fatty acids, they need to be in a certain ratio, and we're all out of whack because our diet is full of the wrong ones and we don't get any of the ones that we want. And because of the way our body processes these things, these ones, once they're converted over, if you have too many of the ones you don't want, you can't convert back. So you don't have the machinery to do that. So what we need to do is we need to boost the ones, the good essential fatty acids, the omega-3s, and we need to decrease our 6s and 9s intake, because then our body can regulate that pathway and convert over as needed. So that's where EPA and DHA, EPA is very good for the cardiovascular system. These inflammatory kind of regulators, as far as essential fatty acids, make a huge difference in brain, nervous system health, and then also controlling stress and the negative impacts that stress is going to have as a result of inflammation. So the stress recovery program that we offer here in the office, how does this work? So I talked a little bit about how to book a discovery call at the beginning. This is where you would start, right? Go to the link below, click on that, and schedule a discovery call with our health coach, Carla. Carla is who helps me run the SOS program. She's the one that coaches all of the lifestyle, goes over all the testing protocols, and we interpret your results together and put together a plan so that way you can stay compliant to combat stress, reduce that stress impact in your life by having a plan, and then also interpret what you need to do health-wise, supplement-wise, exercise, diet, spirituality, mindfulness. All of these different factors need to come into play. So what we do is we evaluate with a questionnaire. So when you schedule the discovery call, you're also going to get a health assessment, and then there's also going to be a self-assessment for stress to see how much chronic stress you're under, to determine, all right, where are we starting at here? Are we at our severe level, or are we at a pretty mild level? Now, everyone falls in somewhere in that spectrum, but the questionnaire is going to help us develop a sense of where you're at, as well as the in-depth health history. So looking at what are your previous injuries? Have you had head trauma in the past? Have you had any sort of post-traumatic stress disorder or stress disorder, right? It doesn't always have to be traumatic, but every person's going to interpret things that happen to them differently. Knowing what your diet, your exercise routines look like, knowing the medications you're on, the other diagnoses you've had, all of these things get collected, and we're interpreting those things as part of your care. The initial visit with me and Carla, we're going to be performing the Dutch test at home. That's something you do over a 24-hour period. But the initial visit with us is looking at all that information we took in and then starting to make a decision, all right, on what we need to gather a little bit more of. We start getting started on the brain-based chiropractic care to start activating that brain in a different way, mechanically through that nervous system, using different stimuli. And then you're going to be meeting with Carla to start talking about your goals. That's kind of number 3 there, right? After that initial visit, you start looking at short and long-term goals being established. We need to figure out, okay, where do you want to be in 5 to 10 years? What does that look like for you? Does cancer look like part of that plan? No, right? Does autoimmunity look like part of that plan? No, not where we want to be. If those things are going to happen to us, we want to try to avoid those things and eliminate that from that 5 to 10 years. So if we look at that 5 to 10 year goal, that's that long term that we need to shoot for. Now we go down to intermediate, right? What's our next 3 to 6 month plan to make sure that we can get to that 5 to 10 years? And then outside of that 3 to 6, it's like, what's our tomorrow plan? What's tomorrow? What's the next day? What's the next day? What's 1 week? And then the next time you come back, let's look at how well you achieve that goal. And if we need to dial it back because you weren't able to do it and we shot too far, right? We dial it back and we get something that you can win at. And then we stack up win after win after win till we're at 3 to 6 months. And then we can retest your Dutch test, look at, okay, where are these things falling? Are we making a progress as it comes to inflammation, the effects of chronic stress, the potential of developing cancer, the autoimmune diseases, optimizing your brain function, all these things we can look at in this test to determine that the last 3 to 6 months and the goals you've had and the success you've been making is making a difference. So then the next thing we do, right? Next 3 to 6 months, looking at 5 to 10 years still, developing goals in the next 3 to 6 months, keep progressing. So the appointments are going to be scheduled for follow-up goal progressing monitoring on a regular basis. The resources for implementation are going to be there in your day-to-day. You're going to discuss those during coaching sessions. You're going to discuss those in appointments with me. We're going to be continually revisiting those goals. It's not only talking about symptoms. It's talking about what do you want? What are we doing every day to counteract the things that we don't want? Follow-up appointments and testing, like I was saying, at that 3 or 6 month mark, depending on where the patient starts at, and then looking at webinars and in-office talks just like this. Find videos, find things that provide the information you need, that make you certain that you're doing the right things. If you work with people who are looking at the research, who are giving you good information, who are continuing to fuel you in the right direction and stay in touch with you and actually monitor whether you're being successful, that's what you need. That's what everybody can benefit from. Slowing down, taking the time to talk to somebody who can help you sift through all of the clutter and all of the garbage that's out there influencing you negatively and get you back on the right track. So how to get started? Scheduling that 15-minute discovery call. Again, go to the link below, click on it, get the call scheduled, and Carla will be in touch with you. The health assessment will come to you so we can start to look at kind of a basic health assessment of where you're starting at. And that health assessment, take it seriously. Answer it accurately. Give us the best information you can, because that's going to allow us to make the best decisions moving forward and progress you through your care that much faster. Join our Facebook group. So we have an SOS stress recovery group. If we have other patients who are going through the program on this group, we're going to be responding to questions there. We're trying to build a community of people who have gone through the same process, so that way you can have support from others beyond us. The more support we have, the more we understand stress, the more we're addressing it as a community and a whole. That's going to give us all a better chance to combat this, so we don't have to work so hard to overcome the world that's out there coming at us every day. And then scheduling your initial visit so we can collect and send in your samples and get your results, right? That's when you're into the meat and potatoes of what we're doing in this program, is once you're in that initial visit. But we need to understand that you're a patient who is dedicated, who wants to address this, because 80% effort does not get 80% results. 50% effort does not get 50% results. These things are not easy when we start, but we need to get started in order to do that. We need to make sure that you are dedicated and you're serious about making these changes before we go all in with you. Does that make some sense, right? So what it boils down to, you need to know your family history. You need to know if cancer, autoimmune disease, those things run in your family, because if they do, you may have the genetic makeup that makes you more susceptible to them. You need to know how much stress you're under and be honest about it. Is your career, is your family, is your relationships, are these things causing a lot of stress for you? Because if they are, there's things we can do to address that. It's not a bad thing to admit that, you know what, there's a lot coming at me and I do feel anxious and it does bother me, it does affect my sleep, and it does do these things to me. So be honest about it and know. That's why our stress assessment is a self-assessment. You can take it every single day to monitor how much stress you're under in different areas. And that's information we can track over time to see how you're progressing and how you're handling it, and help you develop strategies to do that. Know if you can tolerate it. So test. The Dutch test, what tells us so much about genetically, where do you fall, nutritionally and lifestyle wise, how well are you doing to combat this stress? And then it equals your odds of whether you're going to develop an autoimmune disease or cancer coming down the road, which are the things that we feel like, you know, even heart disease and diabetes, these things that affect so many people that are lifestyle diseases. Why does our lifestyle cause these things? It's because it's causing us so much stress that our bodies are breaking down over time. It's not actually even bacteria and things in our environment that are making us sick. It's that they're causing so much stress that our bodies literally can't handle it anymore. So let's test and see where you're at so then we can develop strategies to combat that. And then know you have the best possible plan, right? That's what the testing, that's what the coaching, that's what the chiropractic care, that's what knowing this research is, that's what access to our Facebook group and the videos here, having somebody in your corner who knows the factors that matter. And then they help coach you on how to get those factors into your life, build them in over time, and have support to do it. That's what you need to know. So if you guys have further questions, this is our contact information for the office. You can visit our website there. We're going to be doing some revamping of that website. So I'll probably do an updated version of this video, not probably the whole webinar, but talking through our website so you guys can navigate that. But please reach out to us to find out more about how to get into the program. Schedule your discovery call with Carla through the link below. That will get you in touch with her, and that will get you started the most efficiently. And outside of that, this is very, very important. If you can't tell, I'm very passionate about getting this information in my patients' hands and in other people's hands who need to know why these things are happening to them. We can help. There is hope. So let's just get started. Thanks, guys.